Hello all, we were supposed to get to chapter 3 in class today, but we didn't, which is fine, because this one's a really straightforward, short little chapter. So what I'm going to do is go through this one and then begin chapter 4, and then zip you a link to this video with an attached quiz. So normally your quizzes are going to be in class, obviously, without notes, but this one you can use your notes if you'd like, because I think that might actually help prepare you for the exam coming up on Tuesday. So really all we have to get through Monday is we have to make sure we get done with chapter 4 and then at least start talking about what that rough draft should look like. Sorry, that was a dog bark. Noodles got close to the dog and things were getting kind of dicey. So this chapter talks about verbal communication, not nonverbal communication, and I think it's pretty straightforward because it's the main mode of communication that we use. So words, language, which is a body of symbols. Most commonly words, but it doesn't have to be language, doesn't necessarily have to be words. And the systems for their use in messages. So a language is something that would be a similar set of symbols used in the same language community. So we all speak English, obviously, but then I think probably your generation speaks a different sort of language than mine does, even. So that would be part of verbal communication. So breaking that down a little bit, a speech community just means speakers who use the same language. So in a broad aspect, that's English, Spanish, French. On a smaller aspect, that would be very, very specific peer groups, if you will. So words are just symbols. They're arbitrary, they're ambiguous. So there's really no innate connection between the object and the symbol. An example of that your book offers is the term couch potato. So it's interesting that, why do we call someone a couch potato? Does it really have any sort of connection with each other? Now, it's possible that we're talking about, it could have some etymology, such as, let's say somebody said, I'm gonna veg out on the couch, and then that becomes a couch potato. I don't know the exact etymology of the term, but it's kind of arbitrary, it's ambiguous, and language can complicate those. So I have a German friend who, she came into town last year, and we went shopping, and we went running around and had lunch, and then we came back. She flopped down on the couch and she said, "Oh, I'm damaged." What she meant to say was, "I'm wiped out. I'm really tired from all the activities that we'd finished." But that didn't translate into that same language community. So the best thing she could think was, "I'm damaged." So it was, for whatever reason, it was hilarious at the time. So really, we're not in the same language community, so it does impact communication, right? So what's the purpose of language? There's a lot of purposes of language, but what can cause conflicts of interpretation are other things. For example, if the ambiguous nature of language. So one of your assignments for extra credit was to rewrite cliches, and it's kind of coming from this lecture, because ambiguous can really cause some problems with communication acts. For example, if I were to tell you, "Let's meet this afternoon for coffee," what does that mean? Is that 12:01? Is it 3 p.m.? Is it 4 p.m.? What does that even mean? So it's really relative to the person, and that ambiguity can cause tension. The meanings of words are more so within the people who receive them or deliver them, in those senders and receivers, than they are in the words themselves. So, for example, if I tell you I'm driving an expensive car, what does that mean? Do you interpret that as a $50,000 vehicle, a $20,000 vehicle? That's completely relative to the people who are interpreting that communication act. Another term that your book mentions is creative ambiguity. So you'll notice I'm bolding things because I'm pretty sure that's going to be on the test. So these would be terms to learn. For example, creative ambiguity is when I say one thing and I mean the other. You might think of it as sarcasm. So if I say, "Oh, okay, that movie was really interesting," what I mean to say it was an awful movie, but I'm being ambiguous on purpose. I'm giving this creative license for you to interpret that however you will. So sometimes we do that when we're trying to save somebody's feelings. The other day I made dinner. I made a chicken and lentil Gouda cheese flatbread, and I asked my husband what he thought of it, and he said, "Well, it was new," which was a nice way of saying he didn't like it, right? So how does that apply to other acts of communication? Something I hear a lot as a professor is a family emergency. So I can't take the quiz, I can't take the test because I had a family emergency. Now for me, a family emergency means something pretty intense. We're talking a major illness, death, and accident. But that is interpreted loosely for others, you know. So having that same language community and kind of agreeing on what those terms mean makes for clearer communication, obviously. So what is the relationship then between meaning and how one interprets the meaning? Is there's some very clear vocabulary terms that you would need to learn for this chapter. Words have two levels of meanings. One's denotation, which means is the dictionary level of the word, and then connotation is then how you interpret that word. So, for example, if I were to tell you, this person's a liberal. Well, what is the dictionary definition of liberal? Okay, it means it's somebody who has alternative lifestyles or open to other views, perhaps. But the connotation of that in a conservative viewpoint would have a negative connotation of that. So sometimes that connotation and denotation varies according to the synaptic content. So the word changes depending on how you use it. I loved vacation in the mountains where it's cool and you see cool animals. Obviously the word cool, that adjective cool, has different meanings based on different levels, the connotation and denotation of it. So for example, if I say, I'm spending time with family, that might take that to mean just immediate family. Now my son has a group of friends that they've known each other since they were 6 or 7. So for him, he also considers that family. And so that, again, that connotation changes for different people. Now, we talked about this a little bit today. So one of the neat things about language is the relationship between language and meaning changes. So language in a speech community changes over time. So we were talking about today how low key and shook has become something that's part of your language community. Maybe not so much with mine. So we add new words all the time. Bling, which is kind of an old term. I don't know if you guys even say that anymore. But a desktop now means something different than it meant with my generation. Now you guys think of it as a computer. What's on your computer? Googling is now what we say for searching something. Texting, something sick. All those things are new words that we're adding. And maybe you guys could school me on some new words that I'm not familiar with. And obviously our language changes as we become more multicultural. So we already know words that are part of our language now, and because of our relationships with other language communities, like the word kindergarten, petite, siesta, chow, all of those, we have part of our language community, but that was from a different cultural appropriation of certain levels. How does that affect communication? It can affect communication in terms of relationship levels. There's a content and then a relationship level of meaning. So content level is a factual interpretation of the words. So if I tell my husband, I see you did not do the dishes, it's just factual. The dishes are not done. But the relationship level is what is communicated about your relationship. So if I were to say, I think you're being lazy, that's a relationship level. So I think this becomes problematic because it leads to being passive-aggressive instead of saying what you think. Instead of doing that perception checking that we talked about today, we end up doing something a little bit more damaging when it comes to communication. So definitely know the difference between those two. Most assuredly be on a quiz or test. So how can you improve your language? Number one is we want to avoid maybe using polarized language. So there's not really a word for in between, so we have a language that we say skinny or fat. And unfortunately, when we define somebody that way, it changes our perception of that individual. So we try to avoid that. We try to avoid loaded language. We try to be very PC, be rhetorically sensitive. So how can you improve your language in terms of verbal communication? Is A, to avoid that polarized language. Avoid the 4 main categories of potentially offensive language, which are pretty obvious: sexist, racist, religious, cultural, non-inclusive language, and profanity. So improving your language skills, that just means you want to clarify your meaning like we talked about before. Don't tell me, oh, I'll be there in a while, give me a very specific time. Don't say somebody freaked out, because I don't know what that means. I might interpret that very differently than you do. So make your message memorable and use concrete imagery. And this is why we have that cliche assignment now. It ties into this right here. Avoid the cliches. So I want you to give me 5 cliches and then rewrite them. Now your book gives a very specific mention of an example of Don Imus. He was a disc jockey several years ago who was fired because he used offensive language. And so some people would argue that's freedom of speech. Not so much. That's not That's not what other people thought. Now we have just enough time for me to jump into chapter 4 very quickly because it's a very long chapter and I just want to make sure we get to it. So the next chapter is probably my favorite because it's there's just so much nuance to nonverbal communication. So anything that's considered a body action or a verbal quality that's not language is considered nonverbal communication. So 60% of our social meaning is actually nonverbal, which is kind of surprising. It's actually more than what your words say, it's what your body say. So how you use your body, the voice, space, time, your self-presentation, how you groom, what you're wearing, all of these are sending off nonverbal communication and nonverbal messages, even if you're not even aware of it. So what are the functions of some of the nonverbal communiques? We substitute for a verbal message. So like if I were to tell you, talk to the hand, I don't even have to say the words talk to the hand for you to know that that's what I'm meaning. Or I could put my hand out and you know that means stop, right? We use it to emphasize. If I hold my hands out and say, boy, that fish was this big that I caught. I use those nonverbals to emphasize a message. I use it to contradict. So have you ever had anybody tell you bad news but they're smiling? It's obviously contradicting the message that they're delivering. And we use conversational regulators all the time. So when you're talking to somebody and they nod to give you, hey, yes, you can continue talking. Or they put their hand up to stop interruption. Or something like that. That would be to regulate conversation. Anything that uses your body, gestures, emblems, anything like that, is considered kinesics, which is probably I would say the most well-known form of nonverbal communication. What's interesting about that is that sometimes we do something like an adapter that responds to a physical need, like what if my hair is in my way and I flip my hair? Somebody else might interpret that as flirting, right? So that's why we sometimes send mixed cues that we don't intend to. Direct eye contact is considered kinesics. So for in the United States, direct eye contact is considered good. In other countries, not so much. If you're talking to somebody, for example, and they're tapping their foot or shaking their leg, you interpret that as a nonverbal communique of nervousness or impatience, but maybe that's not what they're trying to convey at all. So just to recap pretty quickly, anything dealing with your body, gestures, is considered kinesics. Eye contact is oculesics, very specifically, but that won't be down the test. So when you're trying to make eye contact with somebody, we talked about this the other day, listeners actually keep 70% of eye contact, whereas the person delivering the message is at 40%. Your facial expressions are considered kinesics. Your posture, so how you're facing somebody when you're talking to them. Are you directly oriented toward them and listening and open, or are you closed off? Are you having that motivated conversation regulator? Are you pacing back and forth? Do you have is all body language and conveying messages? How we break down some of these kinesics, and I have just time to do maybe 2 more slides, then we'll have to move on. An emblem is a nonverbal communique or message that has a very direct verbal translation. So if I shake my fist at you, I give you a high five, you know exactly what that means. It has a direct verbal translation. Like, for example, if I give you a thumbs up, though, but it's cultural, because in some cultures that's considered a compliment, in other words, that's not. So you have to be very careful that you're looking at the cultural context of that. An illustrator is something that I use to enhance. So, like showing something about the fish. So, it's another example of that. And finally, just your face, your facial expressions to have a lot of nonverbal messages. So, do you have wide eyes when somebody's talking to you that convey surprise, or your eyebrows raised? Sure, you've heard the term poker face. So, poker face means that you're not conveying a lot of message or emotion in your face. Whereas if you don't have a poker face, you're very obvious about how you're responding to a message. Okay, we did a lot very quickly, and I really appreciate you guys being willing to listen to a video in addition to lectures. I think this is a great way for us to make sure we're on track. So I'm going to see you on Monday, and we will begin finishing chapter 4, and then we're going to finish and start with chapter 7 and 8, so you know exactly what to expect for that rough draft that will be due on the 9th. Okay, and you'll also be having a test that day, so that's a heavy day. Thank you so much. You guys have a great weekend, and I'll send the quiz off with this.